This is Global Tennessee, news, analysis, and commentary from the Tennessee World Affairs Council in Nashville. Global Tennessee is produced in association with the Center for International Business at Belmont University and the International Business Council of the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce. The World Affairs Council is a nonpartisan, nonprofit educational association, and the views expressed on Global Tennessee are those of the participants.
Welcome to the June 30th edition of Global Dialogue, the International Affairs Speakers Program of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. I'm Patrick Ryan. Tonight we have a special program that might well be guided by the maxim, "My interest is in the future because I'm going to spend the rest of my life there." That quote of early 1900s inventor Charles Kettering was one of the few kind things about the business of forecasting we could find. Since we're all going to spend the rest of our lives in an increasingly complex and challenging future world, we've invited three distinguished panelists from the Office of Policy Planning at the State Department to talk to us about foreign policy through a long lens. We'll explore overall foreign policy goals and priorities of the department and what the world in front of us looks like from Foggy Bottom, the center of American diplomacy. We'll be mindful that there's a lot on the to-do list at state nowadays, so we might spend a little time looking at the here and now, but we'll try to also get in some prognostications. A note about the Office of Policy Planning. It was created in 1947 by George Kennan at the request of Secretary of State George C. Marshall. The policy planning staff serves as a source of independent policy analysis and advice for the Secretary of State. The staff's mission is to take a longer-term strategic view of global trends and frame recommendations for the Secretary to advance U.S. interests and American values. With us this evening from the Policy Planning Office are Martha Sims, whose portfolio includes counterterrorism, diplomatic security, and Western Europe. She was previously Special Advisor to the Counterterrorism Coordinator, and before working at the State Department, she was on the House Homeland Security Committee under Chairman Michael McCaul, working on foreign policy and terrorism screening policy. Shawanesh Underwood covers NATO, Nordic, Baltics, and South European issues. Shawanesh previously served in the Press and Public Outreach Office in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. Colonel William Schaum is a U.S. Army Senior Service Advisor to the Department of State. He previously served as the Chief of the Office of Defense Cooperation in the Republic of Turkey. Prior duties included extensive assignments across the Middle East and in stateside assignments focused on that region. The bios here are brief in the interest of time, but you can see their extensive accomplishments on our website, tnwac.org. Additional thanks to Irina Karamanova at the State Department, who was instrumental in assembling tonight's terrific panel. Our moderator this evening is Professor Thomas Schwartz, Professor of Political Science and Professor of European Studies, Vanderbilt University. His considerable academic credentials are also on the website, but I'll mention here that he is the author of Henry Kissinger and American Power, a political biography to be published in September 2020. We're looking forward to a great read about a fascinating person and period in American diplomacy. So that's the distinguished panel we've prepared for you this evening. Before we start, we have a couple of administrative items. First, you can start now to add your questions to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Second, we welcome you becoming a member of the World Affairs Council or contributing to support our global affairs awareness programs. Just visit tnwac.org to help the cause. May I suggest a $20 donation, much below the cost of dinner and a movie. Lastly, our guests tonight will be as forthcoming as possible in their remarks and responses to your questions. However, please note that the content of this session is off the record. We will begin with about 20 minutes of remarks from the panel, followed by 20 minutes of conversation guided by Professor Schwartz, and then about 15 minutes of your questions. And now, Martha Sims.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here today to represent the State Department and the Office of Policy Planning, where we three work. So to reiterate, as Pat said, we're going to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes. Then we'll open up the conversation to Q&A for the remaining period. So we're talking about the future today, but our remarks focus to some extent on the present, but looking into the next decade and what we think it will look like. And it may come as no surprise that we think that the future is going to look quite a bit like the present. So we'd like to describe the world that the United States will be facing. We'll start off with a brief overview of this administration's approach to foreign policy, and then outline the major challenges and opportunities that we currently face and how we will be dealing with these issues over the next decade. This administration approaches the world with the goal of putting American people, US businesses, and US foreign policy interests first. This is the meaning of American first foreign policy. This doesn't mean America alone, however. Most of the challenges we face cannot be handled alone, even if we wanted to. But we cannot put the interests of supranational or multilateral institutions over those of our own. This administration has been guided by a belief that nation states are the most stable and legitimate actors on the world stage. They are the only source of democratic legitimacy. Governments have to serve the interests of the people they represent, and this administration is committed to serving the American people first. But this also means cooperation with others. And by working together as nation states within existing international structures, we will be able to create a more free, secure, and prosperous world. So on to the challenges that we face and will continue to face over the next decade. The American public has become accustomed to thinking about US national security threats as stemming from the Middle East or Afghanistan. They typically involve foreign wars and terrorists trying to harm Americans. Most Americans are less familiar with the unique threats posed by China. This is intentional. China has been quietly executing a strategy to tip the balance of international levers in its favor, taking advantage of our free and open system to do so. Of course, jihadist terrorism remains a threat, but it is no longer the primary threat that it represented in the decade and a half after 9/11. Instead, we are recognizing an attempt by China to displace the United States as the world's major power. And when we say China, we are, of course, referring to the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. It is the Chinese people who are being deprived of their freedom and dignity under this autocratic regime, and we empathize with them. Over the past decade, the US has tried to expand cooperation with China as a way to bring it into the international system. The intention was good, but in doing so, previous administrations too often acquiesced to Chinese demands on our longtime ally Taiwan, and we downplayed flagrant human rights abuses, such as the massacre in Tiananmen Square. America did less than it should have when China bullied its neighbors, Vietnam and the Philippines, a US treaty ally. And we were caught off guard when China claimed the entire South China Sea. In the words of Secretary Pompeo, these bad outcomes were all too predictable. They were predictable byproducts of dealing with a secretive regime that doesn't respect fairness, the rule of law, and reciprocity. The Trump administration's national security strategy has given expression to a growing consensus about the real threat that the CCP poses to US businesses, the US military, and indeed the entire international system. In the economic sphere, the CCP seeks to weaken US businesses through systematic IP theft. They demand that companies self-censor and hand over key business secrets to continue operating in the Chinese market. Tech companies are required to give the CCP access to data on Chinese citizens. They pressure our film and entertainment industry to avoid criticisms of China. What's more, this heavy-handed behavior is moving beyond China. Increasingly, US companies cannot criticize the CCP on US soil or European companies on European soil. We've all heard the stories about the NBA apologizing for its players' comments or Chinese threats to European governments who criticize their coronavirus response. China furthermore uses finance to gain leverage internationally. Its foreign direct investment and infrastructure investments have saddled parts of Africa, Europe, and Latin America with unsustainable levels of debt. China's Belt and Road Initiative is part of an effort to create leverage globally by investing state assets in infrastructure projects in countries that are in untenable political or economic situations. These debts then come in handy later when the CCP needs a vote in its favor at the UN or demands silence on blatant misdeeds like the sale of shoddy PPE equipment. Militarily, we've seen one of the biggest and fastest arms buildups in modern history. The PLA's capabilities far exceed what is needed for defensive purposes. China seeks to dominate not only its region, but to develop asymmetric capabilities to prevent the United States from engaging in the Indo-Pacific. It lays claim to the South China Sea and the Strait of Taiwan in contravention of international freedom of the seas. According to CSIS, China's defense budget ranged between 6 and 8% of its GDP since 2016. By comparison, US defense budget was about 3.4% of US GDP in 2019. But perhaps more pernicious is the CCP's manipulation of diplomacy and multilateral institutions. In China, our diplomats, journalists, and academics are strictly limited in what they can do and with whom they may speak. More broadly, China seeks to make multilateral institutions, such as the UN, work only in its favor. It does so not merely by seeking its own advantage within these institutions, but by undermining the institutions themselves and using tactics that are contrary to the rules of the international order to do so. The CCP fears that these institutions pose a threat to its ideology, and so it seeks preemptively to ensure that multilaterals validate its authoritarian system. It succeeded most recently by pressuring the World Health Organization to delay the declaration of a pandemic until March 11th, weeks after the outbreak spread globally, and 2 months after WHO officials had visited Beijing, where they celebrated transparency from the CCP's top leadership. China limits the access of its citizens to any news outside of state-backed outlets. It seeks to subvert outlets that criticize the CCP overseas, particularly in its own backyard in places such as Taiwan and Hong Kong. Beyond the Indo-Pacific, the party's intelligence agencies, the United Work Front, which is a Chinese external influence unit, and its propaganda outlets have embarked on a global campaign to change public opinion in favor of Beijing. Finally, China continues to commit human rights abuses against its citizens, from the camps in Xinjiang to the people of Hong Kong, to those Chinese citizens who tried to raise the alarm about COVID-19. So in sum, competition with China is a high priority for this administration and for Secretary Pompeo. And we have sought to better understand the threats that China poses so that we are best positioned to both counter and compete against it in this and in future administrations. And we're doing so by trying to enforce the rules and norms of trade. We're trying to level the playing field for US businesses in China, and we're building up the capacity of other friendly regional allies to lessen their dependence on Chinese investment. So my colleague Shawanesh will build on some of these steps in the second half of our remarks and discuss the Indo-Pacific a little bit more. But first, we're going to turn to the next lesser but equally challenging threat from Russia. So I'm sure folks here are a bit more familiar with Soviet history perhaps than Chinese history, but similarly, in the same way that we were a bit naive about China, we were also probably a bit too optimistic that Russia would fundamentally change after 1989. Under Russia's current leader, a former KGB agent, whose name I probably don't need to remind everyone of, Russia uses foreign policy and disinformation to distract its people from the failures of its illiberal government and its economic weaknesses. It does this by invading countries, Georgia in 2008, Ukraine's Crimea and the Donbass in 2014, and it does this in violation of the UN Charter. It acts as though the Central Asian countries were still subordinate territories of the Soviet Union. It is operating increasingly beyond its borders in the Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, with the goal of displacing the United States and advancing its own economic interests, regardless of the implications for democratic governments and humanitarian crises. One only has to look at Syria to gain a picture of Russia's influence overseas. Russia also flagrantly manipulates international rules and norms to its own benefit. Russia is frequently in violation of international and bilateral commitments. That's a reason that the United States withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, and the Open Skies Treaty more recently. By turning a blind eye to the flouting of these agreements, we indicate that rules don't really matter and that we aren't serious about following them. So we must hold Russia to account by refusing to cooperate with their deception. Like China, Russia uses digital tools to undermine the West. It runs a sophisticated disinformation operation to foment civil unrest and turn citizens against one another and democratic institutions. This is a threat to all of us in the United States, any political party and any institution. Secretary Pompeo has made clear that we will challenge these abuses by working with allies to establish deterrence through groupings such as NATO, the G7, the D10, Democracies 10, and others. The US is also helping those countries most vulnerable to Russian aggression, such as Ukraine and Georgia. We're helping them stand up for themselves with lethal military assistance. We're working with the Baltic countries to build more sophisticated digital defenses to withstand cyber attacks. We are providing funding and investment to our Mediterranean friends so that they are not vulnerable to China's manipulation of energy supplies. I should note that this administration has been successful in convincing NATO members to increase their defense spending. This is the result of persistent diplomacy making the case for burden sharing. However, we still have to face the unfortunate fact that even some of our closest European allies still underestimate the Russian threat to their own security, cooperating with Moscow, for example, on Nord Stream 2, which the US has opposed along with the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Croatia. But now let's turn to the threats from Iran and North Korea. Iran has a 40-year history of unprovoked aggression towards the US and its neighbors. They have tortured their own people and have murdered Americans in Iraq and Lebanon. They have provided safe haven to members of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda since 9/11. Their quest to develop nuclear and ballistic capabilities poses a fundamental threat to US national security. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, threatens freedom of navigation and trade in the Persian Gulf. It trains and directs its members to use asymmetric tactics in the Middle East and around the world, such as by firing missiles at Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The IRGC harasses US Navy ships in the Persian Gulf. It arms proxies in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and the Palestinian territories, even Afghanistan and Pakistan, in an attempt to create a Shiite crescent of power from Tehran to Beirut. Iran's proxies have made peaceful life difficult for the people of the Middle East, many of whom seek to rebuild their societies after years of war. They prop up unpopular governments in Iraq and Lebanon. And while Iran's government is focused on its foreign military operations, it also brutally suppresses its own people who have protested repeatedly for basic freedoms and improved social conditions. Similarly, North Korea refuses to give up its desire for nuclear and ballistic weapons with the goal of enriching its own leadership at extreme cost to its citizens. It also continues to deploy asymmetric attacks against the West, particularly cyber attacks and targeted assassinations, which is one reason that North Korea was redesignated as a state sponsor of terror, an SST, at the beginning of this administration. The US approach to Iran and North Korea has taken the form of maximum pressure campaigns. In the case of North Korea, the US has pulled together one of the largest international efforts to sanction North Korea and bring them to the table. With Iran, the US has regained previously lost leverage through sanctions that penalize banks that facilitate international Iranian oil purchases. Decreased revenue has resulted in fewer funds to support the Houthis, Hezbollah, Iraqi Shia militias, and Hamas. Through persistent diplomacy and public messaging, the US has convinced allies to designate Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization. We have regained military deterrence by defending the waters around the Persian Gulf and strengthening the defensive and cyber capabilities of regional allies. And finally, on our list of threats, we turn, last but not least, to international terrorism. While the department talks frequently about shifting to a great power competition posture, there is no doubt that we will need to stay in the fight against ISIS, if anything, because ISIS has not given up its goal of establishing a caliphate. The coalition to defeat ISIS, comprising 79 members, has successfully provided training, funding, and technical assistance to local forces on the ground. Still, daunting challenges remain, including frequent attacks on US personnel by Iran-backed militias, ISIS's covert attempts to regroup, and an intransigent political landscape in Iraq and Syria that frequently fuels local grievances. Finally, while most of the US government's focus since 2014 has been on ISIS, Al-Qaeda continues to pose an ever larger global threat as it integrates itself locally across the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, Syria, and South Asia. Well, if those challenges sound daunting, hopefully I can comfort you by turning slightly to some of the more positive news. So now that I've walked through those external challenges, I'm going to turn to my colleague Shawanesh, who will discuss potential opportunities that will help us deter these threats. And then she will, I think, turn it one more time to our third colleague, Colonel Shawn.
Thank you, Martha. And thank you once again to the Tennessee World Affairs Council for having me here today. And as Martha mentioned, I will shed some positive light on where the U.S. is going as far as our foreign policy direction is concerned in regards to highlighting, the strengths of our alliances. So our greatest source of strength is our alliances. One former US diplomat described our alliances as our comparative advantage vis-a-vis Russia and China. Our alliances are based on a deeply shared values and similar outlook toward the world. Russia and China partners are short-lived and purely strategic. Given the concerns we've laid out about China and the CCP's malign behavior, Secretary Pompeo has placed great importance on an Indo-Pacific strategy that builds up our friends to counterbalance China in Eurasia. This strategy envisions a free region composed of secure sovereign states, trading freely with each other along international principles of fair and open exchange. In this strategy, we see a major role for India as a large and powerful democracy, as well as Japan, Australia, South Korea, and Taiwan. We provide military equipment and support to a variety of allies, including Taiwan. While we continue to strengthen our bilateral relations in the Indo-Pacific, it is also vital that these countries work more closely with one another. Smaller South Asian countries such as Thailand and the Philippines also have their place in the Indo-Pacific strategy, particularly because they are more vulnerable to predatory Chinese investment and military intimidation. ASEAN is the largest destination for US foreign direct investment. The new BUILD Act and its Development Finance Corporation will lead the way in improving market access and leveling the playing field for US businesses. Rather than the China model of state-directed investment, which frequently comes with strings attached, the US seeks to foster greater private sector opportunities throughout the region. And now I'll turn on to an area of my expertise, which is Europe. Europe continues to be the region that most closely shares US values and interests, and is a vital partner facing the next decade's national security threats. China has used targeted financial investment to gain political influence over European governments. However, our allies are seeing the threat more clearly and realistically in light of recent events, such as, we know that Europe now understands that they have to be more careful not to allow adversaries to divide the alliance or use misinformation to drive a wedge between us. Secretary Pompeo has announced a strategic dialogue with the European Union concerning China. This is very important. The major democracies will be stronger in facing communist China if we stand together. However, we should be aware that some European countries have shown signs of prioritizing the business opportunities in China over attention to human rights, and indeed as an alternative to the Atlantic Alliance. We should work against Europe pivot to Asia if it means a rejection of the West. This will be an ongoing challenge. And next we'll turn to NATO, which is basically a key indicator of the US's commitment to the Atlantic and the Europeans' commitment to the transatlantic relationship and security. But one area that we have been stressing to our NATO allies is burden sharing. Burden sharing within the alliance is one of the key factors to lowering tensions over the future of NATO. You already know that this is a key issue. I'm sure many of you have already heard that President Trump sees this as an important area, and this position will definitely not change, even if there is a new president come November 3rd. We will also need to work with our European allies to secure critical infrastructure, particularly energy security. This will continue to present challenges over the next decade, particularly in the contested areas of the Arctic, the Three Seas area of the Central Europe, between the Baltic, Black, and Adriatic Seas, and the Eastern Mediterranean. In all three regions, China and Russia seeks to purchase or build energy, transportation, or digital infrastructure, which will give them leverage over these countries. And so with that said, I gave a little bit more of a positive view, but still we laid out some challenges there with our European allies. And so now we'll turn it over to Colonel Sham, who will discuss Turkey, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to the World Affairs Council for having us. First of all, let me apologize. My camera doesn't work properly, so the icon you see is taking the place of my face. Let me start off talking about Turkey, since we left off with NATO. Turkey remains a vital, if complicated, NATO partner. Since 2015, Turkey has pursued a more aggressive and independent foreign policy with a view towards staking out a path that is not dependent on any great power. That shift gained significant momentum following the 15 July 2016 coup attempt, for which the Turkish government blames Fethullah Gulen, a former confidant of Erdogan, currently living in exile in the US. Our refusal to extradite him, mainly due to the fact that the Turks have yet to present a compelling case for extradition, severely chilled our bilateral relationship, and this in turn has led, among other things, to a warming of relations with the Russians. However, we should not misconstrue this as a change in orientation on the part of the Turks. There are obviously and continue to be numerous challenges in the bilateral relationship. We have issues with that with the Turks with regard to our policy in Syria, with significant issues with the countries of the Eastern Med. They've purchased equipment from the Russians, namely the S-400, which has caused us to talk about activating the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. And they've detained several U.S. citizens over the last several years. However, the Turks know that a functioning relationship with the U.S. remains in their interest. And moreover, despite the outward appearances, their relationship with Russia is both tenuous and transactional. In both Syria and Libya, the Turks and the Russians find their international ambitions at odds, and they continue to jockey for position in those countries. The challenge for the U.S. is to navigate this narrow path between maintaining the 50-year alliance and containing the more counterproductive impulses of the Turkish government. In the Middle East, we continue to work closely with partners to counter terrorist organizations, secure energy resources, and achieve greater political stability. Our effort to defeat the Daesh physical caliphate has been successful, but the organization remains. We will need to rely on local forces who continue these efforts into the future. Moreover, we will continue to foster close relationships that help counter Iranian aggression and malign influence in the region, and that of its proxies. Particularly Israel, the countries such as Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia have been instrumental in this cooperation. Indeed, the threat of Iran has brought friendly nations in the Middle East closer together. The relationship between the Gulf and Israel is actually at an all-time high. Most recently, the Iraqi parliament voted for a prime minister who we believe will be an effective ally and leader, and we are hopeful that this development will lead to a new era of greater political representation, stability, and economic growth for Iraq. In Africa, we continue to support increased economic growth by working with some of our best friends in the region, particularly Ethiopia and Kenya. American companies are eager to invest in Africa, and we must harness the potential of Africa's tremendous youth population and drive Africa's economic growth and create real prosperity. In contrast to what the Chinese are attempting to do, which is essentially use a mercantilist model to exploit the continent and to their own ends. It is critical that we continue to advance peace and security across the continent. We do this by strengthening our defense and developing partnerships with African governments as well as to regional security cooperation mechanisms. And finally, Latin America has been generally a source of positive relationships in recent years. The trend is likely to continue as many of the nations have made sharp turn toward democracy, free enterprise, good government, away from dictatorship and socialism. And the corruption that's been endemic in that part of the region is also waning. The choice has become clear to many countries in Latin America. You can look like Cuba, Venezuela, or Nicaragua, or you can choose to look like Colombia, Panama, or Mexico. As Secretary Pompeo has pointed out, there's more democratic cooperation in our hemisphere today than at any other point in our history. And part of that is due, in large part, to fruitful multilateral organizations such as the Organization of American States It has fostered increased political and economic freedoms. It has also led to improved cooperation through the hemisphere on issues such as terrorism, transnational crime, and drug trafficking, improved financial and regulatory transparency. The designation of Hezbollah by Colombia and Argentina has made a major step to counter illicit actors in the region. Despite these positive efforts, Venezuela and Cuba continue to pose threats and be a challenge to the United States, propped up with illicit financial flows from Russia, Iran, and increasingly China. And then I'll turn it back over to Shawanesh for some concluding remarks.
Okay, and so finally, as we, think about the value of our alliances, we understand that, the United States understands that we have to look inward, especially because domestic issues are, gaining a limelight in our, in the way that we do our foreign policy. We have seen, we're aware of, the current situation, and we are definitely dedicated to pursuing a more perfect union, despite, we recognize that the protests that have happened here in the United States are a demonstration of our commitment to democracy. And we want to just continue to acknowledge that where we may fall short, we continue to strive to be a more perfect union. And this is what makes us different from authoritarian regimes and what makes our country so great. So thank you so much, Patrick and Dr. Schwartz, for inviting us, and we look forward to answering your questions.
Okay, thank you so much for the presentations that you all gave. Let me start off by saying that I appreciated, the positions that you've had to take. I confess to a degree of skepticism about a number of the statements made in terms of the contradictions and sometimes between certainly the rhetoric of the administration about allies, about relationships with Russia and China over the last 4 years. So that I think, and I would imagine that many of our viewers here have some of that skepticism too. Let me just though start off with the biggest question that was certainly highlighted by Martha's presentation at the beginning, and that is the question of the United States' relationship with China. This seems to have become now what many of us with some historical sense think is a new Cold War. Is that where we are headed? Or are we, is this going to be, are we going to get into a situation of rivalry and conflict with China that will force our allies to choose between us and China, that will divide the world in a manner similar to the Cold War? What is the policy planning staff see as the next 5 to 10 years in the U.S.-China relationship? And I offer that to anyone who wants to even to take a stab at it.
Maybe I'll jump in, and then Shawanesh and BJ, feel free to follow up with any additional thoughts. I mean, it's really interesting that you raise the Cold War. I think there's been a lot of thinking about the Cold War as a model and as an interesting historical comparison. I think that you'll hear this from other folks in the administration, within the department, as well as other agencies. I think that it's fair to say that there are parallels, but there are also differences. So I think one major difference would be that in the Cold War, I know, Dr. Schwartz, you're a professor of European history, and we've talked a little bit about Europe, but I think the role of Europe is very interesting if you were to kind of compare today's relations with China versus the US relations with the Soviet Union. At that time, Europe kind of was stuck in the middle. And I think that there was a lot of fear that both the military as well as the nuclear and the ideological components of this conflict were going to play out somehow in Europe, particularly centering around Berlin. I think compared to today, I wouldn't say it has this dimension where Europe is stuck in the middle between these two poles. This is much more of a global challenge, and I think it involves everyone on the globe. And beyond that, it's much less of a arms buildup. This competition is taking place in a number of different channels. So there's the diplomatic component, there's the information. I think information is going to be a really big part of what we're going to see in the next decade. Misinformation, utilizing information in strategic ways. There's the financial component, tariffs and trade, IP theft. So it's just much more complex, I think, than kind of the more simplistic US versus Soviet Union arms buildup paradigm. I think the one interesting comparison, though, is the ideological component of all of this. And this is something I've heard Assistant Secretary Stilwell, who's the EAP Assistant Secretary, talk about a little bit. He said that I think in response to a question once about competition, we're talking about competition with China, you know, what are we competing for or over? And his answer was that actually this competition is ideological. That we are offering, or we're competing with our version, our model of governance, which is liberal democracy, and China is offering something else, which is a state-led economy. And so I think if we're kind of have these two models of governance that we're kind of trying to convince the world to use, I think we really do want Europe on our side, embracing liberal democracy. And I think that's one thing that they really can embrace with us. So I guess with that, I might hand it off to my colleagues.
Shawanesh, do you want to comment on that one?
No, I think I'll hand that one over to BJ. Yes.
What I'll say on that is I'll amplify what Martha said. Mm-hmm. There is, I believe, a fundamental difference between the Cold War that most of us who are old enough to remember it experienced in the 70s and 80s and what we are seeing now. And one of the fundamental differences is, while we certainly have a number of issues with the Chinese in terms of their theft of international property, their trade practices, and, as Martha said, their ideology, the United States is not seeking to block or stop China's development. We sought to contain the spread of Soviet Union and Soviet communism throughout the world as part of the Cold War. We're not trying to stop China from expanding and developing their economy. Indeed, developing the economy of China is, I think, in everyone's interest. It's in everyone's interest to see more Chinese prosperous and happy, because when you have a burgeoning, for lack of a better term, middle class in a country, that's when you tend to see a country moderate its views. So I think that there's a little bit of a difference, and I think that calling it a Cold War is overstating the level of competition. Doesn't mean we don't have challenges. Doesn't mean we don't need to be prepared to counter them when they use their influence in a counterproductive way, such as they have with respect to how they've handled the coronavirus and the misinformation that they've put out with regard to the spread of the pandemic.
Connected to that, of course, is that the Cold War, at least in its early stage, involved the United States against Russia and China as allies, the Sino-Soviet bloc, as it was known. It seems to me that, in a way, from Martha's presentation, the sense that Russia and China are both threats to American interests also raises the question of whether the two of them, we may be in the position of having or forcing or encouraging the two to cooperate more against the United States. And I'd like to know what you see in terms of the relationship with Russia, and this may go also to Shawanesh about Europeans having this mixed view of Russia, where Germany has set up the Nord Stream project at the same time as we're sanctioning Russia for its occupation of Crimea, and whether also Russia, of course, still maintains the capacity to destroy the United States with nuclear weapons. And whether indeed, by withdrawing from the treaties, as you mentioned, we're also in a situation where we might get a new nuclear arms race with Russia at the same time we're trying to compete with China. And it does seem to me that this, and not to borrow from Henry Kissinger on this, but one of the goals of triangular diplomacy was the idea of playing the two off. And it seems like the way you've described it is we're pushing the two together, and they're both rivalry to the United States.
Well, in terms of Russia, we look at China as sort of as a strategic competitor. And of course, with Russia, it's really up to Russia to sort of reach out and improve the relationship with the United States. I mean, Russia has demonstrated a lack of responsibility for its actions and continues to do so, and is solely responsible for its isolation from the West. I mean, we want to seek an improved relationship with Russia, but I mean, the deterioration of European security environment, of course, has been entirely due to Russian actions. You know, it's been 6 years now since Russia has actually invaded, attempted to annex, not invade, but attempted to annex Crimea. And we have underscored that we will never recognize Russia's claims over sovereignty over the peninsula. As far as we're concerned, Crimea is Ukraine. However, you know, we will continue to maintain sanctions against Russia's aggressive actions. And we want Russia to fully commit to its, to all the terms in the Minsk agreement. But we understand that China is a strategic competitor, but Russia is just becoming much more aggressive now. And we want the NATO alliance, I mean, to continue to shore up its commitments to defense, and that includes Germany, in order to meet the challenges of tomorrow, as well as to continue to meet the challenges of Russian aggression. Russia is doing all sorts of things. I mean, becoming more aggressive in the Arctic. Russia is spreading disinformation, using malicious cyber activities, energy monopolization, all these things. And so we see that there's a distinction, because Russia at times or whatever seems like sort of like the country that just kind of wants to sow mischief everywhere, whereas and kind of look at things, and we kind of look at Russia sort of like not necessarily being very strategic in its approach and how it's dealing with us. But China, we understand that there is a strategic ally, a strategic competitor, one who is looking at, you know, using its financial resources to gain political influence over our allies and so forth. So we take China, I would say we would take China a little bit more seriously, but we also recognize the Russia threat.
But do you see the two cooperating?
We don't really see the two cooperating per se, but we understand that there are some interests that are aligned.
Okay. Can I ask a question of Colonel Shaw to ask about the Middle East? Mm-hmm. If we could. Earlier in the year, for a brief period of time, it looked like the United States and Iran might actually go into war. There was, of course, the killing of the American soldier by Iranian proxies in Iraq, and then our reprisal of killing of the Iranian commander Soleimani, and things got very, very tense. What is the current status, you might say? Are the Iranians in the position of trying to wait out this administration, effectively believing that the Iranian nuclear deal can be revived? And is this a case where the United States has not been able to make its case for isolating Iran to the rest of the world convincingly? And is maximum pressure working in that sense?
So I can't pretend to speak to describe what the Iranians think or how they're planning to deal with all of this. What I would say is that what we have seen over the course of the last 6 months is we have seen that after an initial spat of reprisals, the Iranians have sort of backed off and withdrawn inward. Now, part of that can be attributed to the fact that they've been hit fairly severely by the coronavirus and their somewhat inept attempts to deal with it, and so they're dealing with that. However, I think that what we've seen is that the IRGC in particular, the loss of Soleimani was a pretty big blow, and the folks that have stepped up in his stead do not have the same skill set that he brought to the table. And I'm not saying that as an admirer, simply as looking at a potential enemy combatant and saying this guy brought some things to the table. He was a skilled fomenter of trouble. Let's put it that way. And I don't think they've been able to replicate that ability yet. That does not mean that they don't. A lot of times people will remind everyone that Iranians are well-known chess players, and chess is a long game, and they make several moves that don't seem to make sense to you until they make that final move that puts you in checkmate. It's hard to tell right now where they are because they're dealing with multiple challenges on multiple fronts. But I don't think that they're out of the game, and I don't think that they're waiting us out. I think that they understand that the United States is serious about preventing them from having nuclear weapons, and that we are prepared. And we have said, and Secretary Pompeo has said on numerous occasions, that we're prepared to use all of our diplomatic options to ensure, one, that the UN arms embargo stays in place, and are prepared to talk when they're ready to talk, when they're ready to be serious about ending their nuclear program for real and their malign activities in the region. We're ready to talk. Over.
I want to switch gears a little bit to ask a more broad question about policy planning staff and some of the issues that many Americans are concerned with that really transcend borders, that transcend. Martha, in her presentation, stressed the emphasis on America first and the role of national states. But there is indeed, of course, problems that really do transcend national states. Climate change and the pandemic have brought those home. And I'm wondering, how does the policy planning staff see the engagement of the United States over the next 5 to 10 years in dealing with more global foreign policy challenges, ones that really do require a great deal of thinking about what the future might hold? I open that one there. Maybe Martha, if you want to take that one, or Shawanesh.
Sure. Global challenge. I mean, so it's funny. I think we know generally what the global challenges are likely to be. In fact, if you read the National Security Strategy, pandemics shows up. Pandemic preparedness is like in the second paragraph. So I think we have a sense of what we need to do to prepare. I think the challenge is always investing in readiness across the board, and putting our energy, bureaucratic energy, diplomatic energy into preparedness. But I guess kind of the theme of our talk, and I think it's really true. Certainly, I haven't been at the State Department as long as Shawanesh. Colonel Sean is a military guy through and through. But I mean, I think it's safe to say that at State Department, it's really true that our relationships are the thing that are going to pull us through any challenge, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's climate change, whether it's international terrorism, cyber campaigns. I mean, I think these are kind of all the things that we know are on the horizon. But really the best solution is close relationships, strong alliances, having these groupings that are really functional, such as NATO, that is our best grouping to deter Russia, or maybe this new grouping, the D10, the Democracies 10, that is sort of Europe plus Japan and Australia and a couple others. So I really think that fostering these relationships is going to be the key, and sort of how exactly we're going to work together, what mechanisms we're going to use, you know, how we can strategically stockpile equipment to prepare for the future, what, you know, agreement are we going to reach on climate change. You know, how exactly we're going to get there is not exactly clear to me, but I am sure that the answer will lie in these relationships.
And may I add, I mean, sometimes it's difficult to to determine like what, you know, we will be focusing on within the next 5 to 10 years. But I could guarantee you that we don't anticipate, you know, our foreign policy positions changing on China's rise, containing Iran, denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. And then, of course, there's also the courtship of Africa, trying to make it a much more prosperous subcontinent. So those are the things that will be sort of the mainstays that we can see remain, just the things that will be, the foreign policy focuses that will remain within the policy planning staff. But yes, with the pandemic, you know, as Martha mentioned, utilizing the NATO alliance will be, you know, even more crucial, our alliances in general, in order to address, you know, the long-term effects of the pandemic. We're looking at, you know, well, for example, like how will countries, how will this impact international borders? Of, you know, what will happen to the Schengen arrangement going forward? Things like that. Looking at the global distribution of the supply chain and global trade. Of course, this will all need greater allied responses and a greater sharing of resources and so forth. So there's a lot that the policy planning staff has to be working on within the next coming 4 months or 5 to 10 years or so. BJ, do you have any to add to that?
Well, I think what I would add to that is I mean, obviously it's difficult, and most of us, I don't think, while the pandemic was certainly in the national security strategy, and we certainly in the U.S. government over the years have talked about how we would respond to a pandemic, I don't think anyone could have anticipated the broad and far-reaching effects that we are now seeing, and I'm not sure we have yet seen what the broad and far-reaching effects of this is going to be when hopefully it will soon begin to wane. But I think the broader, if I were to sort of encapsulate what the future for U.S. foreign policy is, regardless really of the eddies and currents of international relations and such, is what the United States has always done and what the United States will continue to do is encourage countries and partners and adversaries to behave responsibly. When you listen to the Secretary, oftentimes what you hear him talking about is encouraging countries to be responsible members of the international community. We want Iran to become a responsible member of the international community. It's about changing their behavior, not about changing their regime. We want China to behave as a responsible trading partner and a responsible member of the international community. And we want Russia to stop being an agent of chaos and come back to being a responsible member of the international community. So if I were to say what our long-term policy is, it's about encouraging responsibility.
Hey, Tom, I don't want to ring the bell here, but
I understand.
If we could turn to a couple of questions from our viewers. Let me start with Campbell Lehman. And Campbell is one of our high school students here. She's a Tennessee Global Scholar, has been participating in our Academic World Quest competition. And Campbell writes that China has been putting on an emphasis on military expansion in the Pacific, especially in the maritime region. How do you think China's recent increase in its aggressive posture towards other states will affect the U.S. and Japan's military alliance? I realize nobody's an Asia Pacific hand in the crowd here, but
Hand though, so.
Okay, Martha, over to you.
Oh, I said we have a military hand.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was kindly handing it to Colonel Sham.
Colonel Sham, the U.S.-Japan military alliance, we've signed an agreement that we will come to Japan's defense. China has some claims to Japan islands and territorial waters. China's been increasingly aggressive in the maritime environment. Any comment on how that might impact the steadfastness of the alliance or our arrangement?
Well, my first assignment was on the Korean Peninsula, so I have tiny little bit of experience in the Pacific. I think that any aggressive action by the Chinese is only going to drive allies closer to one another. The Japanese understand what the neighborhood that they live in, and they understand the importance of having the United States as an ally. And I actually think it goes beyond Japan, if I'm going to be honest about it. I think if you look around the region, most of the countries are beginning to recognize that they need partners, they need friends. They don't need patrons, and they don't need hegemons. What they need are partners. Even an old adversary, Vietnam, is increasingly looking to the United States for assistance in dealing with a very, very aggressive neighbor in the Chinese. So I have to believe that that's only going to drive us closer together. And I know that there's plenty of stuff about we've had some issues both on the Korean Peninsula and with the Japanese in terms of burden sharing and things like that. Those are things that can be worked out. At the end of the day, they know. We know that we need each other in order to counter some of the less productive behavior of the Chinese.
Colonel, thanks for that. Another question in your wheelhouse with your experience in the Middle East. This comes from our good friend Nazad Harami, who is, director of the Saladin Center here in Nashville. He represents the Kurdish community, and as you may or may not know, that Nashville has the largest Kurdish population in the United States. It was a polling place for the first elections after the 2003 transition of power. Nazad writes, he talks about some of the mistakes that the United States has made in the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, and so forth, which has empowered Russia and Iran, leaving the Kurds alone in Syria, and now also the Libya issue. And he asks, are there any plans to review the policy regarding Kurdistan, and what specifically is the U.S. policy towards Kurds in Iraq? And he is from Kurdistan.
Okay, well, thank you for the question. What I would say, well, first of all, I think it's slightly, it's a little more nuanced than that. We have not left the Kurds alone in Syria. We continue to work with the Syrian Democratic Forces in our counter-Daesh campaign. And we continue to support a situation where all of the peoples in Syria and Iraq are able to live peacefully and prosperously. As far as the Kurds in Iraq are concerned, the Kurdish regional government has been one of the major success stories within Iraq. And I think the U.S. policy is to continue to see that success continue within the boundaries of a sovereign Iraq. And the Kurdish regional government, they had a brief thing where they tried to, there was a referendum a few years back where they wanted to discuss independence, but I think they found that they're better off as a part of and continue to work with Iraq. And that, the U.S. is a firm believer that the Iraq should be a single country with all of its very prosperous parts working well together. Over.
Okay.
If I may, I would just chime in to say that, earlier this year, it was last fall, there was a lot of concern about Turkey and their, incursion into northeast Syria. State Department sprang into action. There were October 17th discussions, and it seems like the scenario sort of turned out as we could have hoped, in that Turkey did not continue onward into Syria. It has didn't storm the SDF-run prisons that currently hold the ISIS remnants from Syria. So generally speaking, and the US has maintained its presence in Northeast Syria. So things are sort of status quo. The US is still standing by its allies, the SDF, and the YPG, and we've had a lot of success with that model. And so, you know, hopefully we'll be continuing the steady state of backing our allies in Northeast Syria for the future.
Great. Let me bundle a couple of questions together by Ambassador Charles Bowers, who is on our board here at the Tennessee World Affairs Council and is part of our news review every Tuesday at 2 p.m. He was ambassador to Bolivia and has a question about Latin America. Basically, not much attention by the Trump administration to Latin America. Is that kind of a forgotten part of the hemisphere? And he also asks if any of you are foreign service officers. If not, why are they not involved in the policy planning process? I don't want to date the ambassador, but he says he remembers fondly the contributions to U.S. policy by George Kennan.
I'm not a foreign service officer. I'm civil service. And as far as Latin America is not in my bailiwick, but I do know that the Trump administration is definitely, you know, a committed partner to countries in the Western Hemisphere, in particular Latin America. And we are trying our best to deepen and expand our security cooperation and economic partnerships with Mexico in particular. We stand with the Venezuelan interim president Guaido, and we are trying to restore democracy there. We're pressuring the government in Nicaragua to restore its democracy and trying to stem you know, illegal immigration. So there's a lot of stuff. There are a lot of things that the Trump administration is doing in Latin America, and so it has not been neglected.
Martha, can you give us maybe a 30-second difference between foreign service officers and civil service?
Me?
Just so our audience understands the distinction there.
Sure. Yeah. So, and Shawanesh, you've had quite a lot of experience at the department, so please also chime in here. But I would just say I'm also civil service. I would say foreign service officers come in through a particular process. They take an exam, and they are selected by a panel, and then they become foreign service officers, where you commit to doing rotations throughout your career at different embassies abroad. Civil servants, such as myself and Shawanesh, we work at the department, although there are, when I say the department, I mean Harry S. Truman Building, Main State in Washington, D.C., although there are plenty of opportunities to do what we call TDYs, so to do short-term assignments for a couple months overseas.
So people would most be familiar with seeing a foreign service officer at a consulate or an embassy abroad.
Yes. So a foreign service officer will be posted overseas. They are posted overseas every 2 years. They take an oral exam. Civil service, we take an exam. We don't take an exam, but we apply for a job through a government website called USA Jobs. We are placed in different categories, professional series. I myself am a foreign affairs officer, but that's different from a foreign service officer, meaning that I focus on a particular region or a particular function and remain in Washington, but have the opportunity to travel every so often. So that's a great thing too.
Sure.
Yeah. I would also just say to the ambassador's question, we have a number of foreign service officers on the policy planning team.
Too.
Actually, the policy planning team is one of the most diverse in terms of career tracks within the department. It's one of the most diverse offices. We have folks from all over, folks from think tanks, foreign service officers, civil service officers. So it's a really great team to be.
And even the United States Army.
And even the United States Army. Yes, we have advisors, military advisors like Colonel Sean, but our office is primarily comprised of political appointees.
Okay.
Who are aligned with the administration. So that way we are focused on what the administration is doing, the administration foreign policy goals, and so forth. And of course, everyone is, because if you are a U.S. government employee, you are working to further the administration in the most positive way. So yes.
One final question. We're kind of long on time here, and the questions don't get any easier at the end. This is from Seth Emerson, and he asks about after the November election, depending on who the next resident of the White House might be, there might be some fence mending required in our bilateral and multilateral relationships. And we've seen examples. Angela Merkel said that the Europeans are going to have to go it alone now, and that, I think that was 2017. Macron said NATO is brain dead. So there has been criticism of America's steadfastness with its multilateral relationships and institutions. Any thought in the policy planning arena how to look towards the sustainability of those relationships in the future? I'll try to put it as delicately as I can. Don't all answer at once.
I would just say, that question is a very Eurocentric question. And as I discussed, I love Eurocentric questions.
Yeah.
We have other allies beyond Angela Merkel and Macron. And these relationships are much more, much less, I suppose, along the spectrum of our domestic political debate. So you might be surprised, actually, when I've been on travel in the Middle East or the other parts of the world, I hear people with spouting, their love of this administration and these great relationships that have been fostered. So I wouldn't put it quite in that sort of black and white kind of Eurocentric terms. That said, I had a professor once who said there was a lot of criticism, or there was a perception that transatlantic relations were quite poor during the Bush administration, but that beyond sort of the political dialogue that you might see on TV, government-to-government relations were incredibly strong, stronger than ever. And I would say, regardless of these swings in administration and sort of political waves, people come and go, government-to-government relations are really very strong, particularly with our European partners. So I don't anticipate that changing, and I think that's certainly been the case in this administration as well.
Yeah, and even more recently, our European partners, at first, we were sort of sounding the alarm about China's rise, and now they've moved into the direction of understanding that, yes, China is posing an imminent threat and trying to divide the alliance. And so as you see certain policies, at first it seems as if, there's that we're going in a different policy direction than, our allies. But as you're seeing now, they're moving in the direction towards, what the United States foreign policy is on certain issues. And so there's lots of cooperation on, denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. There's lots of cooperation. There's cooperation on Iran and other issues. So it's not as if, there's going to be, I don't anticipate a lot of fence mending, so to speak, but I do understand, the question, and I understand the concerns. Thank you.
Great. Let me pose one final question that I have, and this is kind of selfish for World Affairs Councils. Why do you think people in our communities should know more about what's going on in the world? And this might be the on-the-record portion of a testimonial on why people should become members of World Affairs Councils. So please have at it. Why is it important for people to know the world?
I'll go ahead and take that quickly. I think there's two pieces to it. One is that in the world we live in today, everything is interconnected. You can talk about the butterfly effect, or whatever metaphor you want to use for it, but I think the last 6 months have proven in a very, very striking and perhaps almost terrifying way just how interconnected the world is, as to how quickly an infectious disease that started in a very small community right in the middle of a country and spread throughout the entire world and is basically in every country in the world. That's a stark and terrifying version, but there's also positive versions to that. Ideas spread at the speed of light. And so it's absolutely critical that people understand what's going on in the world, because what happens in even the most remote corners of the world has the potential to impact their lives. And then the second thing is it broadens your perspective to understand what life is like beyond the community you live in, or the county you live in, or the state, or even the nation that you live in. In my career, I've been to almost every corner of the world, and every time I've gone to a new place, I've learned something new, and I've gained not only a perspective and an understanding of the people with whom I interacted, but I gained a new appreciation of home every time. And each and every time it was nice to come back home. So I'll leave you with that.
Anyone else, or was that the capstone? All right. Well, thank you so much. Tom, any closing remarks that you'd like to make?
Well, I'd just like to thank the participants for giving a positive perspective. I'll confess I remain skeptical about some of the arguments made, and do think that they're putting the best face forward, and I think I admire that. But I hope many of the positive things work out.
Terrific. Well, I thank you as well. Thanks to our distinguished panelists, Ms. Sims, Ms. Underwood, and Colonel Schaum. Colonel, thank you for your service in tough jobs and tough places. And thanks to our moderator, Professor Tom Schwartz. We're in a world in transition, and thanks to you, we all now have a better concept of where we are and where we may be headed. And thanks to our audience, we hope we are fulfilling our promise of bringing you the world through our webinars, podcasts, and education outreach programs. Again, please consider joining the Tennessee World Affairs Council by going to tnwac.org. That's it for tonight. Thanks again all. Please be safe and sound.